When you've worked on a design project for weeks or months, chances are you've done a fair bit of 3D modeling. But how much have you thought about how that model is going to be visualized? Let's talk about it. It's tempting to think that digital models are meant to be perfect one-to-one reconstructions of three-dimensional reality, but of course, that's almost never the case. If you were building a basswood model of a stadium, for instance, you'd have to omit things like handrails and individual stairs because the parts are just too small. The material itself can't be worked like that. I think it's beneficial to think of digital models like this as well, especially when it comes to models that are intended for rendering. We want to be as economical as possible with our modeling without compromising the resulting images. And to this end, I usually recommend selecting your views as early on as possible in the visualization process. Now, you don't have to know the exact view that you want to take, just a rough one. The exact view is going to require a little more consideration of composition. That's coming in another video. It's helpful to keep in mind that anyone reviewing your work, whether a client or a critic or a teacher, whoever, they're never going to see your actual digital model, only the imagery that you create from it. So that imagery is the sum total of the project in their eyes. Now, I say this because as a designer, it's really easy to get caught up in modeling things that don't matter because they'll never make it into a final drawing or a rendering. And I would know, I've made this mistake so many times myself. Now you might be asking, well, don't all the details matter? Yes, of course they do, but this is about priorities. We're trying to communicate a total design vision, and we need to figure out where best to focus our modeling energy. It can be helpful to keep in mind that the 3D model, the thing that's really easy to fall into the trap of believing is the project, is actually only one of the 6 elements that we've outlined as being the core components of a rendering. And that's not even talking about drawings. That's the subject of a whole other video series. Here's looking at you next summer. Now, because no two designs are ever truly identical, it's almost impossible to give specific modeling advice that's going to apply in every context, but there are some general strategies that you can employ that should help no matter what it is that you're trying to create. The first strategy I can recommend is variation of scale. In almost every scene, it's helpful to have something that's big, something that's medium-sized, something that's small, and something that's just like a tiny little detail. This hierarchy of size is something that you don't necessarily consciously think about when it's there, but when it's not there, you notice it. Images seem flat, cartoony, kind of boring, dull. This variation of sizes gives your eye lots of places to wander to, lots of places to linger on and kind of explore. It adds a level of richness and a level of detail that I think is really important in making good images. Blevins actually has a great article on this that he wrote some time ago. I'll link it in the description below, but it goes into a lot more detail than I can here about like all the particulars of how this relationship might work. The second general strategy I think that deserves some consideration is methods of modeling. Not everything needs to be discretely 3D modeled. I remember learning this the hard way in school myself, thinking that if I wanted to model a brick wall or a tile countertop that I had to model every one of those tiles or bricks individually. That's crazy, don't do that. Hopefully you aren't making this mistake now. You can get by with most of these things using materials and texture maps to create that effect in those places. You do not need to model everything. That's insane. In addition, there's also a lot of things that can be comped in with Photoshop or your image editor of choice. You can often do things like foliage or skies or backgrounds much faster in Photoshop than you would if you were trying to kind of cram it all into a rendering. In addition, a lot of those geometrically heavy objects, especially foliage, trees, plants, things like that, they can really kind of sandbag the whole workflow. They tend to slow down all the modeling and navigation that you're doing, which kind of globally reduces your speed, which is something you want to avoid at all costs. So if there are certain elements that you can comp in at the end, and it's not going to be something that you see in like 12 different views of your model, in which case maybe it's a good idea to go ahead and model it. Think about if there's things that you can put off and then just kind of drop in at the end reasonably with Photoshop or something like that. And lastly, I think it's important just to keep in mind that a lot of this advice is specifically related to rendering. Like obviously we can't do some of these things if the output of our model is intended to be different. We can't do these things if we're trying to make drawings or 3D print something or have something laser cut or CNC milled. There's lots of different opportunities that rendering specifically as an output opens up for us. So we do well to take advantage of some of them, but just keep in mind the context when we're doing those. So I hope all of this has given you some new things to think about how your modeling workflow might be affected with rendering as your primary output, and I hope you guys are enjoying and following along with the rendering series that we've got going. I'll catch you all in the next video. In the meantime, happy rendering.